Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're tackling a topic that's often misunderstood but really, really important. The respectful encounter between Christianity and Islam.
hmm
For too long, I think, the narrative around these two global faiths has been dominated by conflict, but our mission today is a bit different.
Yeah, it really is.
It's not about finding common ground where maybe there isn't any. It's more about clarity. Our sources, they lay out a pretty compelling framework for how we can approach this complex subject with genuine understanding.
Exactly. We're not here to pick sides or, smooth over the real differences.
Right.
Instead, we're diving into the articles and research you've shared to clarify what each tradition actually teaches. And maybe more importantly, the kinds of evidence each tradition asks its followers to evaluate and accept.
Mm.
It's about letting each faith speak on its own terms, without the usual distortion.
Okay, so to really understand, our sources immediately challenge a big assumption many of us hold. This idea that, well, Christianity is fragmented while Islam represents some kind of unified, monolithic belief system.
Right.
Turns out that's a common misconception, and it often derails genuine dialogue before it even gets started.
Oh, absolutely. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is that both traditions, just like any vast, complex human system, they encompass significant internal diversity and theological disagreements, too.
So it's way more complex than that simple picture.
Much more complex than one is unified, the other's chaotic.
Yeah.
That narrative just doesn't hold up.
So let's unpack Islam's internal diversity a bit then, because like you said, that's often overlooked in, well, everyday conversation. What are some of those key divisions we should know about?
Well, Islam, much like Christianity, has major sectarian divisions.
Wow.
The split between Sunni and Shia, for instance, is absolutely fundamental. This divide goes back over 1,300 years, rooted in really deep questions of succession and authority. And it has profoundly shaped theological interpretations, practices, everything, for centuries.
Wow, 1,300 years.
Yeah. And beyond this major split, you also find mystical approaches like Sufism. You have distinct communities like Ibadi Islam, and then groups like Ahmadiyya Muslims who are often viewed as, well, outside Orthodox Islam by many.
Hmm.
And even non-denominational Muslims, folks who resist those sectarian labels, they also highlight this internal variation.
And it gets even more granular than that, doesn't it? Like, even within the largest group, Sunni Islam, there's more richness there.
Oh, yes, definitely. Even within Sunni Islam, there are distinct jurisprudential schools. They're called madhabs.
Madhabs, right?
And they interpret Sharia Islamic law differently.
Mhm.
Now, while they're distinct, these schools showcase really varied approaches to law and practice across the globe. It reinforces that idea that unity doesn't have to mean uniformity. And then there's also the Quran-only movement, which is kind of fascinating. They completely reject the authority of the Hadith, the sayings and actions attributed to Muhammad.
Really? Only the Quran.
Only the Quran as authoritative. And that obviously puts them directly at odds with centuries of traditional Islamic scholarship.
Huh.
And if we step back and look at the bigger picture, you can even see these sort of parallel reform impulses in both traditions.
How so?
Well, just as the Protestant Reformation sought to, purify what they saw as later Roman Catholic developments,
Yeah.
you have traditions like Wahhabism and Salafism in Islam that have aimed for similar kinds of purification, trying to return to perceived original principles.
Ah, okay.
So these parallel impulses, they kind of show that concerns about doctrinal drift, about staying true to the origins, they exist across different religious traditions.
Okay,
It's not unique to one.
So the core takeaway here is pretty crucial then. Neither Christianity nor Islam is monolithic, not even close. Both contain all this internal diversity, theological debates, practical differences, and acknowledging this reality, it stops either side from claiming some kind of superior unity while painting the other as, chaotically divided.
It's a foundational first step, really is,
Yeah.
for genuine understanding.
Absolutely. Okay, so with that crucial understanding of internal diversity now on the table, our sources then move to lay out what they call 3 non-negotiable prerequisites for truly understanding these traditions on their own terms. This sounds like essential groundwork for any meaningful dialogue.
It really is foundational stuff.
So what's the first of these vital preconditions?
Okay, the first prerequisite, according to these sources, is to respect historical origins and context.
Historical context.
Yeah. Christianity, for example, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It emerged from its Jewish roots, specifically the late Second Jewish Commonwealth, a really vital period in Hebrew civilization.
Yeah.
And that Jewish matrix, it shaped pretty much everything.
Mm.
Early Christian scriptural interpretation,
Mhm.
its theological concepts, recognizing Christianity's Hebrew origins is key because it prevents these anachronistic readings where people impose later interpretive frameworks onto earlier traditions. You got to read it in its own time.
Okay, that makes sense. And the second prerequisite builds on that, right? It looks at how each tradition actually approaches its own sacred texts.
Exactly. It's about honoring each tradition's interpretive integrity, how they read their own stuff.
Right.
So Christianity's hermeneutical methods, it's just a fancy word for its approach to interpreting scripture, they draw from things like midrashic traditions and Second Temple Jewish approaches. They don't come from Arabic or Islamic frameworks.
Okay.
And similarly, Islamic texts, they deserve to be understood through their own really sophisticated methods, like usul al-fi and tafsir. You can't just demand that the Bible conform to Islamic interpretive rules or force the Quran to submit to Christian ways of reading.
That would just distort both, wouldn't it?
Totally. It distorts both traditions and basically prevents any genuine understanding from happening.
Okay, so we've got historical context and interpretive integrity. After that, our sources also bring up a third crucial aspect, something related to how all ancient texts, including sacred ones, have actually been passed down to us over time.
Indeed. And this one's universal. It's to acknowledge universal textual transmission realities,
Neem.
meaning manuscript variations, little differences in the copies, they affect all ancient texts, not just one tradition's scriptures.
Ah, okay, so this isn't unique to the Bible, for instance.
Not at all. This includes Islamic sources, too. There are extant variants among Quranic manuscripts. There are multiple Qur'at traditions, different ways of reciting the text that were accepted early on. All this demonstrates that textual transmission challenges, they're just universal. They're not unique to Christianity or Judaism.
And why is acknowledging that so important for dialogue?
Because it prevents the weaponization of textual criticism.
Hmm.
Where one side points to manuscript variants in the other's text, as if that automatically invalidates the whole tradition's spiritual claims.
Right, like a gotcha moment that isn't really fair.
Exactly. All ancient traditions work with transmitted texts that contain variations. They all require careful scholarly evaluation. So it kind of begs the question, doesn't it? If all ancient texts have these variants, why do we sometimes treat it as some unique fatal flaw for just one tradition?
That's a really good point. Okay, so once we establish these ground rules respecting history, interpretation, and textual realities, our sources say the natural stakes, the fundamental differences in what each tradition actually asks adherents to believe, they just emerge more clearly without all the, polemical distortion.
Precisely. It clears the air.
So this isn't about finding some fuzzy common ground, but understanding the true distinctions.
Exactly. And we can start with maybe the most fundamental one, the nature of divine encounter, how God is understood to interact with humanity.
Okay. How does Christianity frame that?
Well, in Christianity, Jesus presents himself as having direct, unmediated access to God the Father. The Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 1, describes this eternal face-to-face relationship. The Greek is prostondion, where Jesus actually shares the divine essence.
Face to face, eternally.
Yeah. And then you have claims like John 14.6, where Jesus makes these absolute universal statements. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's a claim of direct, exclusive access based on his own nature.
Wow, okay. That's a huge claim. And how does that contrast with Islam's understanding of divine encounter?
Well, in Islam, Muhammad consistently presents his revelations as being mediated. They come through the angel Gabriel, or Jibril in Arabic.
Always through an intermediary?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Even in the most significant encounters they talk about, like the initial cave experience where he received the first revelation, or the night journey, the Miraj Muhammad interacts with an angelic messenger, not directly with Allah. The Quran itself is understood as Gabriel's delivery of Allah's words to Muhammad.
So the divine encounter, in the Islamic context, it's always mediated by an angel.
That's the consistent picture presented.
Yeah. Okay. This fundamental difference in how the divine encounter supposedly happened, it seems like that would naturally lead to really distinct evidential frameworks, right? Shaping what kind of faith is expected from people.
It certainly does. It leads us straight into what the sources call the epistemological stakes. Epistemology being about how we know what we know.
Right, the basis for belief.
Exactly. So Christianity asks adherents to evaluate claims made by someone, Jesus, who asserted a direct divine nature and, importantly, comprehensive knowledge of divine truth.
Which, as you said, is an enormous claim.
Huge. Our sources note that these are claims that, if they turned out to be false, would represent just unprecedented blasphemy.
Okay. And Islam.
Islam, on the other hand, asks adherents to evaluate reports of what an angel communicated to Muhammad about God's will. And Muhammad himself in the Quran acknowledged limitations.
Limitations, how so?
Well, there's a verse in Surah Al-Aqaf, chapter 46, verse 9, where Muhammad is instructed to say, "I do not know what will be done with me or with you. I only follow what is revealed to me, and I am not but a clear warner."
Huh. I do not know what will be done with me or with you. That's quite different.
It highlights a fundamental difference, yeah, a difference in the nature of the claims being made by the central figures,
Yeah.
and therefore the kind of evidence presented for belief.
This distinction in how the divine encounter happened, it also seems to impact the type of evidence each tradition primarily relies on. Our sources get into this, right?
Oh, very much so.
Oh.
This leads to the evidence structure stakes.
Okay.
Christianity's foundational events, many of them, rest on things that were inherently public, potentially verifiable events. Think about it. Jesus' public ministry was witnessed by large crowds, right?
Yeah, loaves and fishes, healings.
Exactly. His crucifixion was a Roman execution, visible to many. The empty tomb was discovered by multiple people. And the resurrection appearances were reportedly to groups of people, not just individuals in private.
Okay, so very public-facing events.
Right. Our sources use this striking phrase, a table spread in the presence of enemies.
A table spread in the presence of enemies. What does that mean exactly?
It means the evidence was often presented right under the noses of those who were hostile to the claims. Consider the guards stationed at Jesus' tomb.
The Roman guards.
Yeah. They were enemies, essentially, tasked with preventing exactly what Christians claim happened, the body disappearing. And the story goes, they later witnessed something, and their subsequent bribery, as recorded in Matthew's Gospel, reveals they saw something that contradicted their mission.
So their own actions testify against their official story.
Kind of. Or think about the healings supposedly happening on Solomon's porch in the temple area, right under the noses of the Sadducees, who were theologically opposed to miracles and resurrection.
Putting it right in front of the skeptics.
Exactly. And Luke's Gospel even tells a story where Jesus sends 10 healed lepers to go present themselves for verification to the temple priests.
The priests. Who didn't believe in that stuff?
Precisely. The very authorities who theologically rejected supernatural intervention. It's like submitting miracle claims for expert examination by people predisposed to debunk them.
That table spread in the presence of enemies' imagery is really powerful then. It suggests these events were, by their nature, designed to be scrutinized, maybe even by skeptics, not just whispered among believers.
That seems to be the pattern the New Testament presents.
Hmm?
Yeah. Even something like Paul's Damascus Road encounter, which sounds intensely personal, reportedly occurred while he was traveling with companions. They witnessed the supernatural light, they heard sounds, even if they didn't understand the voice.
Hmm.
And then the sources point to something like the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which early Christians saw as a vindication of Jesus' prophecies. That event was documented in detail by secular historians like Josephus and Tacitus. Public history confirming a prophetic claim.
And they contrast this with other claims.
Yeah, they contrast this pattern with, say, false messianic claims from the same era, like Bar Kokhba, whose origins were more obscure, kind of done in a corner, as Acts puts it, and whose movement culminated in a very public, very catastrophic military defeat. Different pattern.
Okay, I see the contrast. And Islam's foundational events, how do they compare in terms of this public accessibility idea?
Well, Islam's core claims, as we touched on, depend primarily on Muhammad's private revelations.
The cave, the night journey.
Exactly. The initial cave experience was solitary. Most of the Quranic revelations came through his personal encounters with Gabriel. The night journey was Muhammad's individual experience. So even when other people might have been present nearby sometimes, they typically didn't share in the revelatory experience itself.
So profoundly significant within Islam, of course, but qualitatively different in terms of their public accessibility compared to, say, the resurrection appearances.
That's the distinction the sources draw, yes. Different kinds of foundational events being claimed.
Okay, so given these really distinct natures of claimed divine encounter and the evidence structure, it seems pretty logical they would lead to very different approaches to religious authority itself.
Yes, absolutely. These differences fundamentally shape how authority works in each tradition. Christian authority, it emerges primarily from Jesus' own claims to comprehensive divine knowledge, coupled with his disciples' eyewitness testimony to those public events we discussed. including the post-resurrection appearances to multiple groups.
So authority rooted in the person of Christ and public witness.
Largely, yes. Islamic authority, by contrast, depends heavily on the reliability of Muhammad's reports about those private angelic communications. And then, crucially, Islamic scholarship has this ongoing task of evaluating competing traditions, the hadith, about what Muhammad supposedly said or did later.
Sorting through all those reports.
Exactly, which creates, different challenges for adherents in evaluating authenticity and reliability compared to the Christian framework, different foundations for authority.
These are some really profound differences emerging. But our sources also remind us quite strongly about a critical piece of humility we all need when we're evaluating these kinds of ultimate claims. It's about understanding the nature of our own conviction, isn't it?
Indeed. This is so important. We have to remember that our personal convictions about these faiths, whether we're Christian or Muslim or something else, our convictions are always secondary.
Secondary.
Meaning none of us were eyewitnesses to the foundational events of either tradition. We weren't there.
Right. We're receiving the story centuries later.
Exactly. We are recipients. We've all, hopefully, examined the available evidence, texts, history, arguments, and we've made commitments based on what we find compelling, what seems sufficient for that level of dedication. But these are precisely what they are. Our conclusions based on our assessment of the evidence.
Not direct primary knowledge.
Not primary knowledge.
Yeah.
And every single person deserves the right to make that determination for themselves without threat, without coercion, without duress. Which leads us to maybe ask ourselves, why do we so often forget this? Why do we sometimes mistake our secondary convictions for primary, absolute proof, and then get angry when others, looking at the evidence, reach different conclusions?
That's a challenging thought. And this recognition of our secondary position, it naturally leads to, well, the unavoidable truth that comes out of this honest examination. Christianity and Islam, at their core, make mutually exclusive truth claims.
Yes, they do.
And this creates an unavoidable tension, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If Jesus' claims about his divine nature, being one with the Father and his exclusive access to the Father are true, well, then Islam's denial of precisely those claims represents, from a Christian view, a fundamental misunderstanding of divine reality.
Okay.
And conversely, if Islam's claims about Muhammad receiving the final definitive revelation through Gabriel are true, then Christianity's core Trinitarian theology, from an Islamic view, represents a corruption of pure monotheism, shirk.
So you can't really reconcile those core claims. They contradict.
At the foundational level, no. They make opposite assertions about ultimate reality.
And this also means, the sources argue, that we need to be really careful about breaking false equivalencies when we talk about these things. What does that mean?
Well, one common way dialogue gets derailed is when people treat different types of evidence or arguments as if they're directly comparable when they actually operate in entirely different categories.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Take textual preservation versus divine authority.
Okay.
Even if, hypothetically, someone could prove that every single word in the Quran had never been changed from the moment it was revealed, that textual preservation in itself wouldn't automatically prove divine origin.
Right. Perfect transmission doesn't equal divine source.
Exactly. And conversely, finding manuscript variants in Christian texts, which we know exist, doesn't automatically invalidate the theological claims being made based on the overall message of those texts. Accuracy of transmission and divine authority, they operate in different logical categories entirely. You can't just equate them.
That's a really important distinction. The sources even provide an interesting example from within Islamic scholarship itself concerning the Black Stone in Mecca that kind of highlights some of these epistemological challenges, right?
Yes, it's quite revealing. When Islamic scholars themselves are asked about certain traditions, certain hadith, that claim, for instance, that kissing the black stone guarantees paradise.
A specific promise.
Right. The scholars examining the chains of transmission, ISNAD, have responded quite clearly. They say, essentially, we have not found this particular saying in any of the reliable books of Sunnah, not with a sound chain, not even with a weak one. Therefore, it is not permissible to attribute this guarantee to the Prophet.
So they reject that specific claim based on their methods?
Yes, based on the lack of reliable transmission. However, the same scholars, using other traditions they do consider reliable, affirm that touching the stone provides expiation for sins. And they affirm another tradition stating that on Resurrection Day, the stone itself will be given 2 eyes with which to see and a tongue with which to speak. to testify for those who touched it respectfully.
Wow. So they accept other extraordinary claims about the stone.
Based on different chains of transmission, yes. So this example illustrates the kind of uncertainty inherent in reconstructing precisely what Muhammad might have said or endorsed, based entirely on secondhand transmission centuries later. And it shows the selective acceptance of extraordinary claims, even within the tradition's own authorities, based on their evaluation of those transmission chains. It's complex.
It really highlights the different ways evidence and authority work internally. Okay, so given these profound differences we've unpacked, and also the humility required because of our own secondary convictions, what does this all mean for how Christians and Muslims should actually interact? How should dialogue happen?
Well, our sources offer a really powerful model, particularly for Christian engagement, drawing from the New Testament, specifically 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15.
What does it say?
It says, "But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect."
Gentleness and respect.
Yes. And that command becomes even more striking when you think about its original context. Peter was writing to Christians who were facing active religious persecution, real hostility.
So gentleness even when under pressure.
Exactly. It highlights the absolute significance of maintaining gentleness and respect, even when you're defending your deepest convictions, and even when facing opposition.
But there's also a serious warning in the sources about how not to engage, isn't there? Something called the loidoros danger.
Yes, and this is quite sobering. The Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, he lists various behaviors that exclude people from the kingdom of God, and among them, he includes the loidoros.
Loidoros. What's that?
It's a Greek word that basically means someone who is constantly verbally abusive, someone who engages in character assassination, systematic denigration of others, just relentlessly tearing people down with words.
All right, not just occasional anger, but a pattern of verbal abuse.
Exactly. And Paul's warning is stark. Do not be deceived. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor drunkards,
Yeah.
nor revilers, that's loitoroi, will inherit the kingdom of God.
Wow, that's incredibly strong.
It is. The sobering reality, the sources argue, is that Christian dialogue, or any dialogue really that descends into that kind of constant verbal abuse, might actually endanger the soul of the person claiming to defend the faith.
Why? How?
Because that kind of conduct fundamentally contradicts the nature of the God they claim to represent, a God of love, mercy, patience. It violates the core commandment to love your neighbor. It often demonstrates an unrepentant heart. And practically, it just destroys any positive Christian witness.
So the way we engage matters profoundly, not just for the relationship, but potentially for our own spiritual state.
That's the serious implication drawn from that passage.
Okay, so it's clear then, from everything we've discussed, that this kind of respectful study, this honest engagement, it isn't going to magically merge these faiths or cause one to eclipse the other. The goal isn't consensus.
No, not at all. The goal is clarity, not consensus.
Clarity, not consensus.
Precisely. Understanding the real differences, free from caricature and distortion, actually serves both truth and relationship far better than some kind of false harmony built on fundamental misunderstanding.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it leads us to maybe consider this. Christians routinely engage respectfully with other Christian traditions they believe hold serious theological errors, right? Think about dialogues between Catholic and Orthodox leaders, or between various Protestant denominations. Even with groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, respectful conversation is possible.
Usually.
And often, those traditions reciprocate with similar respect, even amidst deep disagreement. So the question becomes, if that's possible within the broader Christian family despite significant differences, why can't Christians and Muslims engage each other with comparable dignity and good faith, acknowledging the differences clearly but respectfully?
That's a powerful challenge. So this whole framework then, it's really a call for adult dialogue, isn't it?
That's exactly what it is, a call to maturity and engagement.
It asks us to approach each other with maybe open hands rather than clenched fists. Speaking to each other instead of just at each other.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Coming together, willing to be challenged, maybe even enriched by understanding another perspective, rather than just seeking the ego satisfaction of proving ourselves right.
And it means laying down those weapons of mass distraction, the caricatures, the distortions, the irrelevant arguments.
Right. And instead, picking up the tools of genuine engagement, things like historical honesty, interpretive integrity, textual humility, and just basic mutual respect for the other person as a fellow human being.
Because when we approach each other that way, we create a different kind of space, don't we?
We do. A space for encounters that can genuinely challenge us, teach us, and even when we walk away still disagreeing profoundly, leave us both feeling a bit more human perhaps than when we started.
Our approach to dialogue should reflect the character of the God we claim to serve.
Patient, kind, seeking understanding, slow to anger, rich in mercy, yes. Ultimately, though, the natural stakes are significant. We can't pretend otherwise. Christianity and Islam make fundamentally mutually exclusive claims about the nature of divine revelation, the identity and person of Christ, and the ultimate path to eternal life.
And no amount of respectful dialogue is going to erase those fundamental differences.
No, it won't. And it shouldn't try to.
But understanding what each tradition actually teaches, getting beyond the caricatures, the projections that serves both truth and relationship, it stops Christians from arguing against Islamic positions that Muslims don't actually hold.
Right.
And it prevents Muslims from dismissing Christian claims they don't accurately understand because they've only heard a distorted version.
Precisely. And those epistemological differences we talked about are real and have consequences. Christianity asks adherents to evaluate claims made by someone, Jesus, asserting direct divine nature and comprehensive spiritual authority, claims supposedly supported by public events documented by multiple witnesses. Islam asks adherents to evaluate reports of private angelic revelations received by someone, Muhammad, who explicitly acknowledged his own limitations and uncertainty about ultimate destinies, at least in some passages. These are just different types of evidence requiring different forms of evaluation.
So you can't fairly assess one using the other's primary criteria.
No, you can't. And neither tradition can be reduced to the other or even fully understood to the other's lens without fundamental distortion.
So the call then is not for agreement. It's not for syncretism.
No. The call is for the kind of mature, respectful engagement that allows each tradition's actual claims to be understood and evaluated fairly on their own terms.
And when we do that,
we honor both truth, the pursuit of what's real, and we honor the people created in God's image who hold convictions deeply different from our own.
Okay, so as you, our listener, reflect on this deep dive, maybe consider this. In a world that's so often driven by conflict and misunderstanding, what personal biases or assumptions might you need to lay aside to truly try and understand a perspective radically different from your own? Without, of course, compromising your own convictions, but just to understand accurately.
That's a challenge.
That's all for this deep dive. Keep digging, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.